Oh, I bet that music caught your attention, and it sets the stage for our conversation on this hour's edition of In the Market with Janet Parshall. Thank you so much for joining us, friends. Okay, roll up your sleeves. If you recognize that as the theme from Peter Gunn, it says a little something about your age. But even more importantly, it says you probably like detective shows. Who doesn't? You can't change the dial any night of the week, and there's a detective show. Why? Because I think people really like to do investigation. Except when it comes to Christianity. And then for some reason, we're not investigating the way we should. But we're going to talk to a man today who's going to be our teacher because he knows a little something about looking into cold cases. J. Werner Wallace, or Jim, as we get to call him this hour, is in fact a cold case homicide detective. That, I know, now has your attention, but he's a whole lot more than that. He's a missions leader. He's a church planner. He's worked on cold cases that have put him on the national stage show. He showed up in places like Nightline and Fox News and Court TV. And by the way, he's got some pretty stunning ways of introducing evidence in a courtroom. He's the kind of guy my husband, the attorney, or my daughter, the lawyer, would call on to help present their evidence. So he does these visual presentations in the classroom, and that really now has just radically redefined how some capital offense trials are conducted. And he was a man who had a very interesting background. And that's where I want to start this conversation. But first, I want to tell you the name of the book is called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the gospel. Great stuff coming your way. 1-877-548-3675. 1-877-548-3675. Oh, I have a million questions. Anybody who loves apologetics has my attention, Jim, because that's my passion as well. But my first question to you is, because God has placed eternity in our heart, how did you grow to be an atheist?
Boy, I tell you, that's a big question to start with. By the way, I did recognize that music. Does that date me? I guess it does, huh? So I guess I'm basically in that generation of folks that no one's paying attention to because we're just too darn old. But anyway, I definitely found myself as an atheist for 35 years. And a lot of it, if I'm honest with you, is I just had, Jim was too important. I was too busy being Jim's God. Okay, Jim was Jim's God. I didn't need another God to tell me what to do and how to feel about things. And quite frankly, it's nice when you have that kind of control, right? And so a lot of that for me was my own kind of enmity toward God, my own desire to be my own God, that, is the kind of the nature of the natural man. And that's really where I was for many, many years. And although that evidence was out there, I would have found ways to twist it to serve my own purpose, to be honest with you. And I did that. And I had a lot of friends that were Christians, who were involved in law enforcement that really did not take an evidential approach to their faith. And I used to think, my gosh, how can you be so committed to evidentialism and just about every aspect of our professional lives? But then when it comes down to my asking you a simple question, I can tie you in knots in 30 minutes. And I just didn't feel I had a lot of respect for these folks who I knew to be really nice guys, but just did not. It seemed like they had a step of blind faith. They believed in spite of evidence rather than because of it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. I say it all the time here, being in the nation's capital. We have the highest per capita number of PhDs than any other place in the country. And so knowing what you believe and why you believe it is extremely paramount in the marketplace of ideas. But you're absolutely right. There is this mythology that says you come to the foot of the cross, you put your brains in a shoebox, slide them under the bed, you never use them again. And in the preface of your book, you say you don't have to turn off your brain to be a believer. Talk about that a second.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt in my mind that first day I walked into church, I would be more than willing to visit churches with my wife if she wanted to go. I would go as a non-believer. So, we didn't very often, and most of the time when we did, it was either a Catholic church because her upbringing, had a kind of a traditional Catholic upbringing. And the first time I ever stepped into a church that wasn't a Catholic church, other than maybe for a funeral or something, was when I walked in at the age of 35, and I really walked in as an atheist, and I was not concerned. I still had no interest in Jesus as anything other than this pastor did a good job of convincing me that Jesus was a smart guy. So I was willing to look at him that way. But I was not willing to look at Jesus as anything other than like a wise sage. And so that's really how I began my journey. And I think that for me, I knew that, look, I'm a detective. If God's going to reach me, he's going to reach me with the same view, the same perspective that I take on everything in life, which is evidential. And I know that God does something first. If there's no way I would have walked into that church and had the kind of reaction I did, if God hadn't already started to call me, But basically, God called me and then provided me with another bit of resources from God, which was the evidence related to the gospel accounts. And so I really feel like all of this was a part of a journey, and I never try to deny the power of God in that journey. But for me, I think God knew if you're going to reach Jim Wallace, you're going to have to reach him through the evidence.
Yeah, exactly. But, that's okay, because if we seek him, we will find him if we seek him with all of our hearts. So for some people, and I read with such great interest and was very touched that Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's masterpiece, played a role in your life as it did in my husband's life. Because like you, his attitude was, I want to know. I want to know what in fact is evidentiary out there. And so I think that that's important for us to remember that, yes, there is that point, and Lewis makes this point himself, that it's not a leap, it is a step. And at some point, all of the evidence does require that next step. One more quick question about your family. You were raised in a law enforcement home. So even though you had made you, like so many, the center of your life, so you didn't need anyone else, because your dad was involved in law enforcement, you see what it says in the book of Jeremiah about the human heart being really kind of yucky. Did that turn you off on Christianity at all?
No, I think people have asked me, seeing all the kind of horrific things you see working murders in Los Angeles County, does that have an impact on? And I can say I don't think it really did. I was always able to dehumanize these horrific scenes. So I was always able to walk in and say, this is like a haunted house. These people are not, they're dead. It's not real. Just step away from it as though it's not real, and you'll be able to work it. And that was always my view. So it wasn't so much the problem of evil or the horrific nature of people. I just assumed the worst in people always, like Greg House on the show House. Everyone lies. Yeah. You assume everyone lies. You start off at that position, and that serves you well as a cop. And I did that for a number of years, just as an atheist. But I don't think I had any grounding for my views of good and evil. And what's great about the Christian worldview is it gives you proper grounding for those things.
Oh, what a great spot, Jim, for us to take a break. Okay, that's hint number one. We're going to learn from a cold case detective how to look into cold case Christianity. Evidence that demands a verdict. Remember Josh McDowell's great book? By the way, Sean McDowell was instrumental in helping Jim write this book. So we have lots to talk about. Join us with your questions at 1-877-548-3675. 1-877-548-3675. I hope you're enjoying this edition of In the Market. I want to quickly remind you that this and other programs just like it can be found at inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. You'll also be able to find links to guests, book information, our Facebook and Twitter pages, and so much more. Again, that's inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. Thanks again for listening. And now, back to the program. We are on the hunt for evidence for Christianity. We're talking with Jim Wallace, who's written the book Cold Case Christianity. And as a result of that, this man who has multiple initials after his name and a long curriculum vitae, as a detective, is teaching us how to use our brain. When we come to faith in Christ, we don't just honor him just with our heart, but with our mind as well. We have a renewed mind in Christ. So we should be defenders of the faith. What is the mandate from Scripture? Always be what? Prepared to give a reason for the hope that resides within you. So this is part of us thinking so we can, in fact, be prepared. So, Jim, I'm particularly intrigued, and I thought it was a great point to talk about the distinction between belief that and belief in. But let me step back before we jump into that part of the pool.
Sure.
Just say some of the principles of being a detective. This is what your whole book is about. You take the principles of being a detective, evidentiary, and apply them to Christianity. And number one is, not unlike somebody working on a cold case, it's in the past, there are no eyewitnesses. Christianity, as you point out, is both in the past and no eyewitnesses. So begin to show me the skills of being a detective and how they transfer into my investigation of Christianity.
Yeah, this is one of the great similarities. Not that we don't have eyewitness testimony, we have the Gospels, but there's no living eyewitness to cross-examine.
Yes.
There's no forensic evidence to look at, DNA, things that we typically say are powerful in court. All you have is this really nasty word, circumstantial evidence. And what I try to do in the book is take some of the misconceptions about circumstantial evidence and get rid of them, because I've worked now, our cases take about 2 years to do a case from opening it to arrest, and then who knows how much longer to get to actual prosecution. prosecution. But so we do about 2 cases a year, about 1 case every 2 years, rather. So we've done now, in the last 12 years, I've done 6 cases. That's a slow, meticulous process of piecing together cases that are built entirely on circumstantial evidence. I've never had a case built on direct evidence. And that's just the nature of these cases and of many fresh cases. I think people are misunderstanding the nature of evidence and thinking that if you don't have direct forensic, some kind of scientific evidence, you simply can't come to any level of confidence. But that's just not true. We do this every day in court, and I wanted to kind of demonstrate that so that people will look at the case we have for Christ, the case we have for what happened in the first century, and say, hey, we can have confidence based on the circumstantial evidence we're going to use, just the same way judges tell jurors that kind of evidence is to be considered every bit as valid and as valuable as direct evidence.
Excellent point. So, in other words, you can get a conviction out of circumstantial evidence. So the point is
every day. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. All right. So if it's good enough in a court of law, the naysayers out there say, well, it's circumstantial and sort of cavalierly wave their hand off saying it doesn't count. You're saying as a cold case detective, wait a minute, every day there are people who get sent to prison based on circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, and I think there's a large misunderstanding when people say, well, they'll use this sentence. That's just circumstantial evidence. And we have to take the just out. That's circumstantial evidence, and it's every bit as valid as, I'll tell you what, there are times when direct evidence is typically, Janet, it's an eyewitness testimony. Somebody's going to come in and say, I saw him do that. That's a direct evidence, okay? Now, the circumstantial evidence is very different. You build it slowly. Dozens of pieces of evidence that all point to the same conclusion. The great thing about circumstantial evidence is it cannot intentionally lie to you. You can misinterpret it. You can come to the wrong inference. But circumstantial evidence does not intentionally lie to you, and sometimes witnesses do. So I think in some ways, circumstantial evidence is actually much more reliable once you come to the proper inference.
Yeah, excellent. All right, now let me go back to what you just said before the break, because this falls into the category of circumstantial evidence, and that is this transcendent moral code, good and bad. You say that we live in a universe with objective morality. How does this tie back to circumstantial evidence?
Well, I think we can build a case for our worldview, and I think every one of us has to make a case for our worldview. It's not just the burden of us as theists. We have a theistic worldview. We also have, more specifically, a Christian theistic worldview. But as a non-believer, I had a naturalistic, a philosophically natural worldview. Every person has to answer questions through the lens of their worldview. How do we get here? Why is it so messed up? How do we fix it? So, I mean, the questions about how does life originate are not just questions for the theist. They're questions for the atheist as well. And each of us has to make a case for why we believe we have answers. We have answers for these big questions in life. And so I think when we look at the evidence from transcendent, objective moral truth, from a universe that has a beginning, from the presence of what we see, the appearance of design in biology, the teleological argument, we look at all these pieces of evidence and we kind of begin to make a circumstantial case to support one worldview or the other. How does atheism, for example, explain the transcendent, objective nature of moral truths? It's never okay to, kill somebody for the fun of it. That's an objective moral truth. Where does that come from? If every law's got a lawgiver, where does that come from unless there's an objective, transcendent lawgiver for that law? And I think that's what we have to look at and say, hey, we can build the case circumstantially because all of these pieces of evidence point to one unified source that can be used to explain all of them, and that is the existence of a transcendent, objective, all-powerful creator.
Excellent. Can I linger here for a minute? Oh, it's going to be such a challenge not to go down some of these trails.
I know there's rabbit trails.
But that's, folks, seriously. But they're rich rabbit trails. The point is, they've only got an hour, so I'm going to choose carefully which ones I go. But I want to go to this transcendent argument because I don't think, Jim, it's by mistake that what we're seeing now is a panoply of billboards and bus signs coming from the atheist community that say you can be good without God. That is a very distilled way, I think, of their trying to countermand the transcendental argument. Do you agree?
Yes, and I think that I would say to you as an atheist for 35 years that it is absolutely true that you can be good without God. The question is not whether you can be good without God. The question is, why are you being good without God? What are you grounding goodness in? And it ends up being a matter of personal opinion if it comes from us as individuals. So if we said, oh, gosh, I think that moral behavior, moral ideas are a process of evolution, and we evolve to a certain place where the embracing of these ideas provides for a more survivable species. Well, if it's really in my DNA as a product of evolutionary process, couldn't I say as one member in the species, I didn't evolve that way. Whatever my family lineage is, it brought me to this place where I think this behavior that was atrocious, pick something crazy, like pedophilia. My genetic history brings me to a place where I don't see that as a moral vice. I see it as a moral virtue. I mean, it becomes very much a subjective choice then, doesn't it? And that's the problem with this kind of thinking.
Absolutely. Jim's book is called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the gospel. Excellent, excellent stuff as you and I welcome the opportunity to go into the marketplace of ideas. By the way, I've hot linked Jim's website. So if you go to inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org, click onto his website. It's great. And the book, right-hand side, Cold Case Christianity. So much more right after this. We'll get back to the program in just a moment. But first, did you know that there are multiple ways to give to Moody Radio? If you visit us online at moodyradio.org and click on the Giving tab, you'll see that there's a variety of options to choose from. Or if you'd like to reach us by phone, you can call 1-800-DL-MOODY. That's 1-800-356-6639. That's 1-800-356-6639. And thanks again for your support. Oh, you can imagine Stephen had great fun putting the music together for our conversation today. J. Werner Wallace is with us. Jim Wallace, a homicide detective in his own right, but a great apologist, and he's written the book Cold Case Christianity. So we're starting out, the book, by the way, is broken up into several sections, but I'm lingering for a bit in the section that really is about the tools of a detective. And I'm truly, like you throw a stone over the lake, right, and it just kind of skips real quick. I'm having to go over some of these topics very quickly, but this is the kind of book where I'm going to give you the heads up. You read it, you stop, you linger, you ruminate, you read it again, and you really become honed in your skills of being prepared to give a reason for the hope that resides within you. And in the end, you understand why we are not to be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Folks, we are standing on solid evidence here. So I want to go to witnesses. This is an excruciatingly important point because the naysayers, the skeptics, the cynics, the atheists love to say, oh, well, let's just start with your gospels, okay? You've got a bunch of contradictions in there. So you talk about testing your witnesses and evaluating the reliability of your witnesses. And one of the points that you make in the book is that a disagreement is not a disqualifier. Lots of stuff there, Jim. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. By the way, I noticed that two of your three intro songs are all comedies. Pink Panther, and I'm not going to complain about that. But come on now, we're seriously investigating the evidence here. But it's true that there are complaints I used to make all the time. When you have contradictions, come on, you can't even get the dang story straight about how many angels are at the tomb, or how many women are running to the tomb, or what it says over Jesus' cross. I mean, you got 4 opportunities to describe that, and get them all of them are different. So I think that is sometimes an objection you make that I really it didn't shake me when I first read the Gospels, because by that time I'd already worked a lot of cases where I had multiple eyewitnesses of the same event. So I was able to see the kind of flavor and properties of multiple accounts when they're offered. And what I discovered working the cases long before I ever opened the Gospels was that I've never had a case where 2 witnesses have reported the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, there have been many times where you'll listen to the witnesses and you'll say to yourself, come on, I can't imagine how it even happened that way, let alone there's some apparent contradictions here. I mean, I can't even make sense of this eyewitness statement, and it's not until you assemble all the robust messiness of multiple accounts that you get a clear picture of the crime. And so for me, as I looked through the Gospels, I was actually struck by the similarities. Not so much. I didn't read through them and say, oh my gosh, there are some contradictions here. You can't. Look, I'm sure that the first writers of these things, when they had started to assemble these accounts, at least the canonicler, whoever's putting these together as the canon, assembling these accounts, could have said, let's get rid of one of these because, man, 1,000 years from now, someone's going to look at this and say, this is a problem, Let's go ahead and change some of the details. But they also knew that this is the rich, robust, and messy nature of eyewitness accounts. We should expect this kind of messiness and be glad we have it, because if it was all identically the same, we'd be suspicious in that regard. So I think it's important to understand the nature of eyewitness accounts.
And Jim, and you see this in the courtroom, and we can see this in the canonical account as well, and that is God writes with the power of the Holy Spirit through personalities of men. So Matthew is going to have a different perspective. Dr. Luke's going to have a different perspective. John, who's dearly loved, is going to have a different perspective. But it doesn't mean the different perspectives create conflicts in the gospel account.
Yeah, and I actually give an example of a robbery. I've worked a lot of robberies over the years too. When you work robbery homicide, there's not a homicide, you're working a robbery, and so I mean, I worked a lot of cases where we have what appear to be contradictions, and what you end up doing is looking at it and saying, well, is it an issue of geographic perspective? Are they somewhere in the room that causes them to see something and miss something else? Is there an issue of personal history that allows them to see certain things with amplification and other things not so much? And is it an issue of emotional perspective? So there's lots of things that weigh in, and you've got to really interview witnesses, not just to get me the facts, but tell me something about yourself so I can see what it is about you that causes you to see this that way. Because in the end, when we go in front of a jury, that's going to be important, because I'm going to have to resolve these issues in front of a jury. So I want to know up front, what is the perspective you're holding? And that's something that's very true in the Gospels as well. You give me an example of this. John, he comes in. I've had this happen many times where you've got a couple of eyewitnesses who are testifying to something, and you try to keep them separated, and sure enough, there's a guy standing off to the side that you think is just somebody who's been cleared by another officer, but he hasn't been cleared, and he walks up after listening to all these eyewitness accounts, you doing the interviews, and he says, I wanted to tell you I saw something too, and you're like, oh, for crying out loud. Why didn't we separate him out and not get him listening to the other accounts? But now you've listened to the other accounts, go ahead and give me your 2 cents. And sure enough, he just gives you what hasn't already been given. He skips over all the stuff he's heard other people give, and he just gives you the extra stuff that he thinks that was missed. And you have to stop him and say, no, I want you to start at the beginning. I want you to give me the whole account. Pretend like you didn't hear what they already told me, because I want to see if there's some small differences, right? And I want to know what those differences are. Well, John's kind of similar. He comes in at the last. He's been listening over the shoulder of the entire Christian community, heard what Matthew has to say, heard what Mark has to say, heard what Luke has to say, and he's simply adding and filling in the details like the last witness to come forward. And that's exactly what happens in our cases all the time.
Wow, amazing. So I want to, and I'm going to get into this, and the music's going to start. So I'm going to ask the question, Jim, and get the answer when we return. That's a perfect segue into the idea of really examining choice and meaning of language. If they're the fingerprints of personality in the gospel accounts, and it seems to me that language choices have a forbearance here as well. When we come back, teach us how that works in the tool bag of a detective as we're practicing the art of cold case Christianity. Jim Wallace is with us, the author of a book by that name, Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective, that would be Jim, investigates the claims of the Gospels. We're going to take a break and come right back. I'm going to try to get to the phones at 1-877-548-3675. I hope you're enjoying this podcast of an earlier broadcast of In the Market with Janet Parshall. And I do want to thank you so much for joining us for the program. I also want to take this opportunity to remind you that my brand new book, Buyer Beware, Finding Truth in the Marketplace of Ideas, is now available. I'm so excited about this book. It really takes a look at the hostile culture in which we live and reminds us through the words of Jeremiah how we can live abundantly. In fact, not just survive, but thrive abundantly because of the promises that God has given us. So I hope you'll pick up your copy of Buyer Beware. You can do it at your local bookstore or online. And thanks so much for joining us for In the Market with Janet Parshall. Little Law and Order there, which is very apropos as we visit with J. Warner Wallace, or Jim Wallace, as he's known to us this hour. He's the author of Cold Case Christianity, which follows suit because this is a man who was an atheist until his mid-30s, found the Lord, realized coming to faith in Christ doesn't mean you never use your brain again. In fact, it's just the opposite. because God is not the author of confusion. Because evidence abounds, we actually become, I think, clearer thinkers. Now, the question is whether or not we're going to take what we know, what we believe, out into the marketplace of ideas and engage the culture. Because just like you were searching, there's a whole bunch of people out there as well looking for answers. And that's what this book teaches us how to do, how to become better apologists by using the tools that a detective uses. And I'm ruining the fact that there isn't 5 hours attached to this conversation. So glad if you missed the first half, you can go to our website and go back and listen to the first half, but you don't want to miss this second half. And I do want to get a call in here. Tina, you're in Illinois. Excuse me. Thank you so much for joining us and your question.
Hi, I appreciate his background so much in this field. And my question is, when you're in the real world discussing apologetics with people, and I've had that question come up about the conflicting numbers of witnesses there, when do you determine when the person really doesn't want your answer, just using it as an argument to try and argue and don't want to hear a true answer? And I'll just listen on the radio.
Well,
Thanks,
that's a great question, and I think sometimes I begin in my conversations with folks to say, what kind of evidence would you accept before we even begin? Let's just find out what kind of evidence you would accept, because that's going to be a critical question to answer. I mean, I think that people sometimes look at this and they will shun the truth. I described it in the book. There's 3 reasons why people shun the truth. One is rational, the other one is emotional, and the other one is volitional. And I want to know really where are people's doubts? Are they just irrational? Is it evidence? I sometimes will have people say to me, Janet, they'll say, well, if God came tomorrow and wrote on the side of this mountain, I exist, and then I was to be examined to make sure I'm not crazy and just seeing that, well, then that might be something that would convince me. Well, gosh, if that's the case, am I going to be able to provide you with God's writing on that mountain right now? I have to spend some time, I think, working with people to say, is there something... You're not always going to have a videotape of the murderer doing the murder. We make cases that lead us to the most reasonable inference, and we get to a place of evidential sufficiency. So I have to ask people, can I make a case with you? Can I begin to talk about these issues? Because it might just be that you're the kind of person who really is going to need a level of confirmation or a level of evidence that I could never provide as a mere mortal. So there's not much point in my going forward if that's the case. So I think it's important just to ask questions about, well, look, what kind of evidence would you be willing to look at the kind of evidence that we typically use in a criminal case to make a case about which suspect is the murderer? That's the kind of thing we can provide. But really, it might be that God has not called them out. It's not removed the enmity that we naturally have toward God. And if that hasn't happened first, now I will say this to you, I'm still willing to go through all the evidence with somebody who's hostile, because I know that at some point downstream, when God has done the work in this person's heart, he will recall the conversations he had for years before that. And the evidence that I offer him now while he's still resisting will come back to mind when he's no longer resisting, because God's done that work in his heart.
Excellent, excellent point. And that's why we wear a spiritual life vest and a chest protector, which takes us to a story that you tell about Mark. Belief that versus belief in. I think this is hugely important. Explain this.
Yeah, it was something that was an eye-opener for me, too. We work homicides, and our team that works homicides also is in charge of all the officer-involved shootings. So if there's shooting is involving an officer, we're going to go out and make sure it happened the way it was supposed to happen and walk through the shooting scene with the officer. And one night, I got called out in the middle of the night to a scene where an officer had pulled over somebody he thought was just a drunk driver. And as he walked up on the car, he could smell the alcohol coming out of the car. He asked him to step outside for the field sobriety test, the FST. And he could tell right away this guy was a little bit more hardcore than he had anticipated. And as a matter of fact, he had inadvertently pulled over a parolee who had just gotten released for a violent crime and was packing a pistol in his waistband and did not want to go back to jail. And he knew if this officer discovered that pistol in his waistband, he was going back to jail. So as my buddy was getting ready to kind of do a search, which is typical of this kind of a setting, he asked him to turn around, do a little quick pat-down search, and this guy knew when he turned away from the officer that he was not going to allow him to pat him down. And instead, he turned back at the officer, had already pulled the pistol out, and was now pointing it at the officer's chest. And he was not far enough away that the officer couldn't kind of reach the gun with his hands, but he also knew that he was pretty much in point-blank range. And as he's walking through this shooting scene with me after the fact, he just told me that, man, he had a decision to make. And look, all of us as officers know that our vest will save our life. We've had shoot tests. We demonstrate this all the time with the vest. We test it. We know that it can save us. But that night, Mark had to make a huge decision. He said, all I could do, I didn't even have my hand close to my gun. All I could do is to kind of tense my stomach muscles and get ready to take the first round from this guy and hope that my vest, he would hit me in an area that would actually be in my vest instead of shooting me in the head. But the point is, I just knew I had to trust my vest, and I would have a chance then to get my own gun out and return fire. And I thought to myself, wow, in that one moment, this guy had an experience that moved him from belief that the vest could save him to belief in the vest, trusting in the vest to do the very thing that he thought it could do. And that is the kind of thing we talk about all the time in terms of a belief that versus belief in. What we want is enough evidential sufficiency. We want God to work and show us what the evidence is so that we can have so much sufficiency, so much confidence that we will step out into areas in our world believing in, trusting in what we already know is true from examining it closely, and that's going to give us the kind of courage that'll put us like Mark in a place where we're not just going to have it in our pocket, we're going to actually live it.
Yeah, amen to that. And that takes us to what you call two-decision Christians, correct?
Yes, I make this point because I noticed that as you go around the country and speaking on this issue, look, all of us know that when you make that first decision to trust Christ for your salvation, to do the thing that you could never do, he having lived that perfect life and us being the mess that we are, we know that when we make that decision to trust Christ for our salvation, we're saved. That's the first decision we make. But I would suggest that there's another more robust version of the Christian life that most of us don't live. We live an abbreviated version of the Christian life. Look, we all feel compelled to share our faith because we feel the compelling call of the Great Commission on our lives, right? But Paul tells us in Ephesians 4 that some of you are evangelists, and some of you are pastors, and some of you are teachers, which clearly means that some of you stink in those areas. You're not called by God in those areas because you just don't have that gift set. But Peter doesn't give us that out. He says in 1 Peter 3:15, all of you have to be prepared to give a reason for the hope you have.
Sir.
And so there's this call on all of our lives to stop being abbreviated, make a second decision. The first decision to trust Christ for your salvation. The second decision to defend what you believe to the world around you, just as Peter has told us we are obligated to do. And that's really the whole situation here. I think we have an abbreviated life when we call ourselves Christians, but we can have a robust life if we identify ourselves as Christian case makers. And it's that second decision I'm hoping this book will help people make.
Amen. And I think it does. Let me go to Linda now, who joins us from Florida. Linda, thank you. And your question, please, for Jim.
It is such a pleasure to be able to speak to both of you today. How are you?
Oh, so great. Thanks
Thank you,
for calling
Linda.
in.
I'm enjoying the program, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading the book. I just happened to be listening to Rabbi Zacharias today, and I listened to one of his, it was the Richard Dawkins versus John Lennox and Rabbi Zacharias today, and talking about the two worldviews. So this is just very apropos. If you could highlight on some of the things that he also says in saying that he made a statement, science called in to adjudicate. What exactly does that mean? It's not a simplistic warfare between science and religion. Science is being called in to adjudicate.
Right. So basically, it's kind of a similar statement as something like this. And maybe you know people who are like this. I'm a scientific person. I think that you have to use science. Science is the only way you can truly know something. So when someone says that science has to be called in to adjudicate, what they're really saying is science is you have to use science in order to determine truth. And I would stop and say, is that really, does that statement make any sense? I would ask them this question. That philosophy you have, that science is the only way to determine truth, is that a truth that you determined through science? Well, no science can determine the truth of that philosophy you have. That statement you just made cannot even be determined to be true by the very thing that you say is all you trust. You can't use science to determine if that claim is actually true. It turns out that's a philosophical presupposition that guides science, but it cannot be determined to be true by science. So I think sometimes when people make that kind of a claim, it's really a very self-refuting claim. It cannot even stand up on its own feet. So I think that what I would try to say is, look, there's lots of things that we say we have to have a foundation for first. And we find the foundation often by looking at what's the most reasonable inference from the world around us, from what we see around us. I think that I take a very kind of reasonable approach, an evidential approach toward these issues, and I think it would be the kind of approach that would be satisfying for me as an atheist. And I don't say it has to be grounded in science. There's a lot of cases I've worked that had no benefit from any of the scientific forensic disciplines that are available, just because it just happened that way. I just didn't have any evidence I could use to make the case that way. Instead, I had to trust and look at and examine and compare eyewitness statements, other pieces of circumstantial evidence to make the case. I don't think that science is the only way to know truth. It's not the high measuring stick by which we measure everything. I think there's lots of other ways to determine truth.
Linda, great question. Thank you so much. And it sounds to me like you're a reader, so I'm going to put you on hold, and we're going to give you a copy of Jim's book, Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the gospel. 1-877-548-3675. I want to remind you again, Jim's got a fabulous website. We always put it right under the short bio of our guests at inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org, in the book, right-hand side where we always put our resources. Back after this. I sincerely hope that this program has helped you in some way today. And if it has, please tell a friend and encourage them to listen to it as well. This and other programs that have aired in the past year are freely available to listen to online at inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. Programs older than that are also available for purchase at moodyaudio.com. And thanks again for listening. Cold Case Christianity, that's the new book by J. Warner Wallace. It's a homicide detective look at the Gospels using the tools of investigation that a detective uses, which is fabulous. I got a bunch of questions online, Jim, but I asked a question, left it hanging, and never went back to it. So if I can, just because I find it intriguing, it's one of the tools of the detective, and that's this idea of examining the choice and the meaning of language. Why is that important, not only to a detective, but as we survey the Gospels, why is it significant?
Yeah, and I use this because at the time I first was interested in looking at the Gospels, I was being utilized a lot at work for doing interviews, and I would often use this process called forensic statement analysis, where I would give a suspect in custody, maybe the murder was yesterday, and I would say, hey, I want you to write everything down on this piece of paper, everything you did from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed, and I'm examining his written statement, looking at how he corrects things, looking at his use of pronouns, looking at his use of tense, looking at how he compresses time, expands time. There's a number of different categories, different colors of pen that I'm using to isolate these different ideas, and it helps me to determine if he's really up to something, and at what time of day would he have been up to something. So it helps me to kind of isolate these different ideas. And so I did the same thing when looking at the Gospel of Mark. I looked at the Gospel of Mark, and it was several weeks after starting the investigation that I started to do some church history, trying to get an idea of what can I examine in these Gospels, and I found that Papias, the early church father, wrote that Mark was writing down the teaching of Peter. And so I thought, well, it seems to me if that's the case, we ought to see Peter's fingerprints in the Gospel of Mark in a way that I could identify using forensic statement analysis. And so I started to use it, and at first, I wasn't all that impressed. But after I finished the entire, and you have to be careful not to stop along the way when you do these analysis, you have to go the whole way through. By the time I finished, I found several issues, several areas that I thought were indicative of Peter's involvement in a way with Mark that's very unusual. It is missing from the other Gospels. And I came to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, Peter's fingerprints were in the Gospel of Mark. I wrote an entire part of that one chapter I have is just talking about that one issue. And it really gave me great confidence, not only in the statements of early church fathers related to authorship, related to who's writing what and where and when, but it also gave me great confidence that this, again, had all the properties that I typically see when an eyewitness account is given to a particular crime.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. 1-877-548-3675. Gary, your question, please, for Jim. Hi, Gary. Gary, are you there? One more try. Gary? Sorry, Gary. Sorry we missed your call. Let me go to another Gary, only this one is in New Mexico. Hi, Gary.
Thanks for taking my call, Janet. Intriguing subject. my question has to do with the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, for capital punishment, they did not even allow one witness. There had to be 2 or 3 eyewitnesses before a person could be put to death. Circumstantial evidence was not allowed, but yet it sounds like in our country it is allowed. I was just curious on Jim's comment on that.
Well, it's not that circumstantial evidence wasn't allowed. It's that we're trying to find a way, and I think it's fair, to look for ways to determine the reliability of witnesses. Now, I would never suggest that we just have somebody come in and make a statement, and, okay, well, he said it happened, so therefore it must have happened. No, as a matter of fact, I would say we need to use the most robust method available to us to see if what he's saying is true. Now, back in those days of the writings you're referring to, one of the most robust ways is simply, does somebody else see that also? And I think that's definitely a way to corroborate an eyewitness statement. Is there another eyewitness who also says the same thing? Of course, we know today we've got lots of other ways to corroborate that as well. Fingerprints at the scene. If he says, I saw him touch that counter in the commission of that crime, well, I ought to be able to find his fingerprints. Now, if I find his fingerprints there, that's not direct evidence. That's circumstantial evidence that actually tends to corroborate the statement of the witness. So I think, first of all, it's that most of us don't understand what circumstantial evidence is. It's basically everything other than an eyewitness claim. Everything else is circumstantial. And so that's why we would use other pieces of evidence to corroborate eyewitness statements. But that's what I tried to do with the gospel writers. I said, look, what is the criteria for corroborating, for making reliable witnesses in criminal trials? Let's take that same template and let's apply it to the Gospels and see if it passes. The entire second half of the book is simply doing that. I would never suggest we trust an eyewitness until we first determine if they're reliable. Now, if we're skeptical about the Gospels, that's a good way to start.
Yeah, excellent. Gary, we're going to give you a copy of Cold Case Christianity. If you wouldn't mind, stay with us. We'll get the info so we can ship it out the door to you. Jim, let me go back to one, because I know that very often one of the reasons why followers of Jesus are reticent is because they're afraid they're not going to have the answer, or they're going to give the wrong answer. But here's another concern, and that is, when do I know when enough is enough? And you talk about this in the book. Speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, the first thing you got to realize is that you're never going to have everything that could be known about a case. There are always going to be a collection of unanswered questions. You know, how did he get rid of her car? How did he get rid of her body? I have no body missing. I just worked on it. And how did he get rid of the body? I mean, these are unanswered questions. Unless he's going to confess to this, we're never going to know some of these answers. And so that's why we don't have a standard that's beyond any possible doubt. The standard in the most robust criminal trials is beyond a reasonable doubt. And we get to a certain place where our doubts are either reasonable or just possible. Possible means anything. Anything is possible. It's possible we're not even having this conversation. We're just dreaming it, okay? But that's not reasonable. Reasonable is a better standard. And so I would simply say, are your doubts possible because you've imagined a possible scenario, or are they reasonable because they are firmly grounded in the evidence that's being offered? That's what's reasonable. It's an inference from the evidence that's been offered, and everything else is just a possible doubt. And so we would tell jurors, take your possible doubts, put them on a whiteboard. You can cross those out unless they are firmly supported by evidence, and those doubts then would be reasonable. And so I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to say, hey, are these doubts that people offer, are they supported by the evidence? If not, they're just possible doubts, and we can actually move forward.
Yeah, excellent. So, Jim, let me come full circle, only in deference to time, because I have 1,000 more questions and lots of people online.
Yeah.
You decided that Jesus was more than just a smart guy, as put forth by that pastor in your mid-30s.
Yes.
In all the work that you've done, have you ever had doubts? I mean, here you are, detective, looking at evidence, using all of the tools in your detective's bag. But when it comes to believing that Jesus is exactly who he said he is, and believing the transcendent authority of Scripture, have you yourself had any doubts?
Well, initially I did. I mean, I started with nothing but doubt. But I can tell you that at some point, when I've examined a case, all the evidence points to the same conclusion. Anything that can be thrown up to me at some point later will not cause me to doubt, because I've got so much on which I have established my decision. And the same thing has happened here. I'm so convinced by the evidence that doubt is no longer an issue for me, because the evidence is sufficient.
Exclamation point. Jim, what a great conversation. Friends, In the Market with JanetParshall.org. Click on right under Jim's bio to get to his website. And on the right-hand side, the basis of our conversation, his new book, Cold Case Christianity. Check it out, and then go out and contend. We'll see you next time.